What if everything you believed depended on where you stood in the room? That idea is not rhetorical or poetic, but foundational for philosophy and life. In every moment, our minds offer a view that feels objective and complete. Philosophers have always argued that perspective matters for truth and meaning. From Plato to modern thinkers, location of thought changes what counts as evidence and justification. This first scene asks why perspective has such philosophical weight in debates about knowledge and reality. Perspective begins as a perceptual fact in science and psychology, but blossoms into moral and epistemic questions. We see the world with eyes fixed in particular places and minds conditioned by history. That simple fact creates deep branching consequences for how societies form beliefs and make decisions. Imagine two witnesses watching the same event from opposite corners of an intersection. Each will tell a story that feels true, vivid, and complete to them alone. The disagreement between accounts reveals how vantage points create incompatible but sincere narratives. Philosophers worry about whether competing perspectives point toward different truths or toward slices of a single truth. Some argue that truth is independent and absolute, waiting to be discovered from any angle. Others contend that truth is shaped by frameworks, language, and the vantage points of observers. To see differently is not simply to notice different facts, but to reframe questions we ask. In philosophy, the act of reframing often leads to surprising resolutions of old paradoxes. A small shift in question can allow contradictions to dissolve into coherent understanding. Perspective shapes moral judgments as much as it shapes empirical belief. When you step into another person's shoes, their actions stop being strange and start being intelligible in context. That simple move can transform blame into understanding without excusing wrongdoing. History shows how perspective makes villains into heroes and heroes into villains across generations. Nations rewrite narratives by changing the vantage point from which events are told. Cultural memory is a layered landscape of competing perspectives and selective remembering. The relationship between perspective and truth becomes urgent in science as well as in ethics. Scientists train themselves to strip away subjective perspective with methods designed to reproduce findings across places and times. Even so, theory-laden observation shows that background commitments influence how data is interpreted. Philosophers of science remind us that instruments and models extend perspective rather than eliminate it. A telescope gives access to deep space, and a model simplifies complexity into a usable viewpoint. Each tool imposes limits even as it opens new kinds of seeing. One way to practice perspective-taking is Socratic questioning that probes assumptions beneath assertions. Asking why we believe what we believe forces us to step back from immediate judgments. That disciplined backward step is the philosophical muscle of perspective shifting. A second practice borrows from phenomenology. Describe experience without interpretation and notice differences. When we slow our language down to raw perception, we discover layers that words usually hide. That difference between describing and explaining reveals where perspective silently intrudes. Perspective taking is also an embodied practice that requires physical repositioning and conversation. Walk a neighborhood you disagree about and listen at doorsteps in parks. The physical act of moving through space combines with human stories to rearrange prior assumptions. Cognitive science offers exercises that train flexibility in perspective and reduce bias over time. Techniques like reflective journaling, role reversal, and counterfactual thinking expand neural pathways for empathy and critical analysis. With repetition, those practices make alternative viewpoints more accessible under stress. But perspective shifting can be abused when used as rhetorical camouflage to avoid responsibility. Skilled actors might claim multiple sides to escape moral accountability or to manipulate audiences. Philosophy warns against relativism that excuses cruelty under the guise of alternative viewpoints. Ethical perspective taking requires integrity, curiosity, and the courage to change mind publicly. It is easier to perform openness than to embody it when consequences threaten status or relationships. The philosophical challenge is to make perspective shift a genuine moral practice rather than a rhetorical flourish. A useful intellectual tool is perspective mapping that charts viewpoints, incentives, and blind spots. By drawing a simple map, we externalize assumptions and see overlaps and gaps. That visualization encourages cooperation because differences become features to explore, not weapons to wield. Storytelling remains the most persuasive technology for shifting perspective across cultures and generations. Stories let us inhabit lives unlike our own and feel consequences we would otherwise ignore. Philosophers and artists have long used narrative to translate other minds into felt experience. Perspective also shapes identity by influencing how we narrate our own lives from moment to moment. The autobiographical voice edits, meaning for coherence, comfort, and purpose. When we discover alternative narratives, we often find freedom from self-imposed limits and recurring mistakes. In politics and public life, perspective taking is both needed and contested at scale. Democracies work best when citizens can imagine others' perspectives while holding institutions accountable. The failure to imagine leads to polarization, while genuine perspective work can restore civic trust and creative solutions. The relationship between perspective and truth returns in everyday decision-making as a practical concern. Professionals from medicine to design thrive by training to look at problems from multiple angles. That habit reduces mistakes and increases the likelihood of solutions that serve broader interests. Perspective practices change what problems we see and what solutions we believe are possible. Small shifts often cascade into significant life changes when practiced consistently. The philosophical payoff is not relativism, but humility combined with a stronger capacity for action. To learn how to see differently, start with a daily 5-minute exercise of listing 3 alternative explanations. Make each explanation detailed enough to be plausible and different from your first instinct. Over weeks, this simple habit reshapes automatic responses and invites curiosity into ordinary moments. Another practical exercise is the role-play conversation where you argue sincerely for an opposing viewpoint for 10 minutes. This practice forces cognitive empathy and exposes weak points in your own reasoning. It cultivates the discipline of listening that is the counterpart to speaking well. Ultimately, perspective is a philosophical tool that empowers wise action rather than excuses in decision. Seeing differently refines judgment, deepens compassion, and enlarges the circle of who counts in our moral calculations. That is the quiet revolution of a life practiced in multiple viewpoints. When perspective becomes a habit, it is not that we lose conviction, but that we strengthen it through challenge. Convictions born of reflection survive scrutiny and become anchors for responsible action. Philosophy teaches us that the best views are those that have weathered storms and still guide us forward. If this exploration gave you a new angle on how to think and act, then the work has already begun. Practice one exercise this week and notice how small shifts rearrange your conversations and choices. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and join us for more thoughtful stories.